Good morning to everybody. Thanks a lot for a nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and I will start right away because we don't have any time to lose. There are many different ways of how to define and justify human dignity. Although most of us are convinced that we have such dignity, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to prove its existence in a philosophically solid way. Therefore, in this talk, I will simply postulate the existence of human dignity as a premise. I do so in the understanding of Tom Regan, who interprets this dignity as a kind of inherent value that belongs to every human being and, by analogy, to every non-human animal as well. This intrinsic value belongs to the individual, coma patient or dolphin, regardless of their current capabilities, that is, regardless of whether they are able to move purposefully in space or can provide themselves with food independently, etc. Besides, this intrinsic value, if there is any, is always given undivided. You cannot have much or little of it. You can only possess it as a whole. It is also clear that the individual and society as a whole have certain moral obligations towards any living being with such value, depending on his, her, or its needs. Thus, with regard to a coma patient, we have the duty to provide him with loving care and competent medical assistance, even if he may never come to consciousness again. And we have a moral duty towards a dolphin to ensure that its life and well-being are not damaged by plastic garbage, oil debris, or fishing nets. But what about human dignity in the Web 2.0? How can we describe the initial situation when we are facing the issues of human dignity for the first time? As we all know, social media users are not simply consumers, but react and publish in their own right. The border between author and audience is blurred. The individual not only presents contents like nutritional tips or commentaries on current political topics, he also presents himself. And as a consequence, the boundary between what is private and public gradually dissolves. At the same time, the user interacts with others. He experiences fellowship and creates his own virtual world in which he spends part of his lifetime. This gives him the impression that he holds innumerable creative possibilities and that he may navigate, much like a discoverer, through a cosmos of unlimited options. De facto, however, the individual actor hardly ever discovers a new territory, but moves in predefined structures and picks up thoughts conceived by others. This said, social media may be understood as a form of empowerment because one no longer has to be rich or famous in order to create a public platform. But at the same time, the standardized self-presentation in the web leaves little room for creativity and the expression of one's own personality. Going for likes and followers, users tend to reproduce the viewer's expectations and to satisfy rigid role models. The authenticity of self-presentation, therefore, is always at risk. Another issue to be taken into consideration is the question of materiality and spatiality, the visual reality of the internet creating the impression of real space. But since this promise cannot be fulfilled and the physical dimension of the person's identity is not realized, there is the urge for its realization in the offline world. At the same time, the lack of materiality changes the perception of the other and his presence. With the loss of physical presence, a whole series of important markers such as gesture, facial expressions, body language gets lost, which would be necessary to assess the quality of a relationship or the current mood of the other person. This is compensated on the one hand by declaring the relationship status and on the other by creating substitute gestures like emoticons which enhance symbolic action, such as joining a friends list, for example, and which are perceived as signs of a certain quality of relationship such as intimacy, for instance. In doing so, new rituals are being created, which primarily serve to ensure a common practice and generate meaning. The behavioral uncertainties associated with the redefinition of the interpersonal encounter make the individual actor more vulnerable to negative phenomena. Such negative phenomena, to give but a few examples, are phishing, cyber grooming, happy slapping, or cyberbullying, and they harm the individual in very different ways. In the case of cyber grooming and happy slapping, for example, the violation of the other and his dignity primarily lies in actions that occur in a non-virtual world, when cyber groomers initiate meetings with their victims by flattering them online. As to happy slapping, offline violence is documented and celebrated online. Similar as in the case of cyberbullying, what results is an endless victimization, the victim being always and everywhere reminded of his or her status as a victim. Unlike conventional bullying, where the group of offenders usually grows gradually only and remains limited to certain groups of people, mostly in a working environment, there is no hideaway for victims online. All these online crimes have in common that the inhibition threshold in the web is lower than in a face-to-face situation, and that empathy for cyber victims is significantly weaker. Both phenomena are probably related to the supposed anonymity in the World Wide Web. On top of that, the multitude of new ways of interacting with the Internet has led to an insecurity in conduct and will furthermore do so, according to communication scientists like Klaus Beck or Miguel Sicar, until new rules and habits have been established. Such uncertainties in behavior cannot only be observed with regard to the individual, but also with regard to the group. While different groups composed of different generations or cultures can coexist offline unproblematically through the formation of niche, for instance, they collide in the World Wide Web. This may be a chance if the common interaction in an open, accessible space leads to a better exchange of ideas and consequently to more understanding, tolerance and awareness of democratic rules and principles. But in reality, this form of societal encounter often is far from being ideal. The user's reactions to the wide range of different opinions exposed in the web often show no opening at all, but a tendency to polarization, retreat, the denial of the common reality, and finally, the fragmentation into platforms of like-minded people. These tendencies are intensified by private enterprise companies through so-called filter bubbles. In order to guarantee an effective personalized advertising and to increase the attractiveness of the company, information that does not coincide with the personal interests or the beliefs of the user is filtered out, eliminated, or shifted to a subordinately sequent position. For the individual on Facebook, Twitter, or Google, this gradually creates the wrong impression that the world only consists of people who think in a similar way, who pursue similar concerns, or have similar interests as myself. However, where these mental and technical mechanisms can be avoided, the global neighborhood offers a wide range of possibilities to expand one's own horizon, to show solidarity with others, and to get involved with them. Some philosophers even think that the ultimate goal of new media is to improve the world. They hereby refer to the user's new closeness to one another, but they also refer to the high quality of the technology involved, which will eventually set free time for creativity and generosity. Even if the gap between reality and ideal seems to be large, the chance of improving man's common interaction is a hopeful perspective, and it is particularly important for the question of human dignity in the social media. But what about morals in general? Is there any such claim in the World Wide Web? Looking for morality in the media, we realize that the actors react with discomfort to the moral standardization of their behavior. This may be due either to the actors themselves or to the normative approaches they are confronted with. Could it be that people have become indifferent by interacting with modern media? Could it be that they disregard values and are drifting into an anything goes attitude? Of course, this question is not easy to answer. However, quite a few observations seem to stand against this argument. In his publication Diplopie, for example, Clément Cheroux presents an analysis of the images of September 11, 2001, published by US-American journalists. He shows that most of them have deliberately avoided the release of particularly shocking photographs, images of severed body parts of victims writhing in agony or helplessly falling down the towers. Also, such photographs were available in large quantities. In addition, one could mention a number of case studies, such as those of Christoph Eisermann, who examines the new media rituals that have developed in connection with so-called dedication videos. He comes to the conclusion that these videos, in which mostly male adolescents film scenes from their respective peer group, put them together in an artful collage and dedicate them to their girlfriend, have a very strong value orientation. Also, no explicit commitment is made. The way these video clips are being produced and the underlying reference system they reflect indicate that these adolescents consider a wide range of moral values such as love, faithfulness, friendship, and honesty important components of their lives. There are many other and similar examples so that we can rightly assume that users have not become indifferent towards moral claims, but that simply their daily routine is too far away from the way ethics has been practiced in school philosophy. Usually the latter's approaches are abstract and do not aim to providing the individual with assistance in concrete situations. At the same time, most people do not reflect upon which ethical theory might be adequate in their everyday lives. They rather respond by force of habit to the practical requirements of a given situation. I therefore dedicated my habilitation thesis to the study of the moral beliefs that media users share in a more or less reflected way and that underlie their everyday habits. To this end, I analyzed a large number of self-commitment codes in which media operators from the sectors journalism, entertainment, communication, public relations and advertising, but also communities of media users commit themselves to certain values. The codes I considered are, on the one hand, international documents that are of importance throughout Europe or even worldwide, on the other, national papers of the German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. The results of this study are relevant to the question of human dignity in the social media and should therefore be briefly presented here. I will then once more go into the problem areas outlined above and show which insight can be gained for our discussion with regard to the basic question that concerns us here. But let us first examine the results of my study. The analysis of approximately 30 self-commitment codes shows that behind the concrete formulations of commandments and prohibitions, there are certain values the authors of the documents believe to be important. It is evident that such commitment does not automatically imply that the respective values are actually being adhered to, but this is not our first concern, because first we need to find out which are the values the users considered as indispensable. And it is only in a second step that we might ask ourselves what to do in order to make these values respected in practice. Anyway, While analyzing the documents, it soon became apparent that the multitude of values alluded to could be divided into several groups sharing a similar concern. Such a first group or cluster of values has to do with transparency. It includes a number of related values such as truthfulness, which compels individuals to communicate as honestly as possible. Its negative counterpart is delusion, which is to be avoided. Accuracy, on the other hand, does not emphasize so much the good intention as the factual coinciding with reality, an understanding that underlies the classical correspondence theory of truth. Transparency, on the other hand, in this case not used as an umbrella term, but as one of the values explicitly mentioned in the codes, represents a broader and somehow softer claim, but at the same time is a guarantee against what should be avoided, deception and lie. Transparency also includes the effort to communicate sincerely, which characterizes it as a value that can help us respect the human dignity of others. At the same time, it allows sufficient scope for the manifold forms of dissimulation and deception that are morally harmless, drama, satire, etc. Who communicates transparently does not leave any room for misunderstandings about what kind of communication is happening. But he indicates clearly when he makes a serious statement or a compliment and when he's telling a joke. A second set of values represented in the codices concerns the value fairness. Fairness means first of all to abide by game rules. This very general prescription is then usually supplemented by one or more of the following requirements. First, it is inadmissible to treat certain persons differently from others without good reason. Second, it is inadmissible to discriminate others or take undue advantage oneself. Third, it is inadmissible to derive benefits from a system maintained by the contribution of others or for oneself without making an adequate contribution. And fourth, it is inadmissible to punish or condemn people inappropriately. Point 3 is called the free rider problem, which deals with a person, the free rider, who, without making a contribution or making a small contribution only, benefits from cooperation to a greater extent than those who make an appropriate contribution, as in the case when using the underground without buying a ticket. Such behavior is usually considered to be unfair, while the reverse, supererogatory behavior, when a person makes an inadequately big contribution and in doing so derives little or no benefit from cooperation, is considered morally neutral or even particularly praiseworthy. Finally, yet importantly, fairness is found in procedures where no party is being favored. The prohibition of unequal treatment, that is unequal treatment without a good reason, is concrete in terms of contents and as such largely unproblematic. The situation is different when it comes to observing certain rules. The requirement to respect a certain set of rules is undefined with regard to contents. It is a procedural rule only which presupposes all parties' consents regarding the specific conditions. In this respect, fairness alone would be too vague, for it only becomes concrete and workable when combined with other values. In contrast to transparency, a value that seems to fit in particularly well with the requirement of social media, fairness assumes a much more general claim and therefore also plays an important role in other fields of applied ethics. There is a close connection between fairness and human dignity because he who respects the dignity of another person will endeavor not to treat him in an unfair way nor give him disadvantage, etc. And there finally exists another obvious connection between human dignity in the case of a value that also proved to be significant in the codes examined: respect. Respect means first of all the appreciation, that is the feeling of approval and liking you have for another person, which also implies accepting this person as an equal partner. At the same time, respect means tolerance, which is to accept others as they are. The term respect then subsumes politeness and the art of considerate behavior, among others, which has sometimes been called courtesy for interaction in the codices. In a specific situation, politeness or courtesy may imply the use of upper and lower case letters, so that the reader does not get the impression you would shout at him, for uppercase looks as if you are shouting. Among the group of values that refer to respect, we also find the value of non-damaging, which would come into play, for example, when people and their stories are being displayed in TV formats such as Frauentausch or horror tattoos. Another form of respect is the moral claim of privacy, which should not be violated. Having privacy means on the one hand not to be manipulated by others, and on the other hand to be able to withdraw from the public, to lead a self-determined life without withholding private data, and to be free to decide with whom these data may be shared. Needless to say that problems of privacy especially arise in the field of data processing, where the responsibility does not lie with a single actor but with a computer program. And there are many more situations in the Web 2.0 where one can decide whether to respect somebody else's privacy or not, as when it comes to revealing a person's identity behind a nickname or an avatar, and so on. The value respect expresses a positive attitude, as we have seen, but its meaning is basically confined to the idea of keeping limits and clearly saying no to violations or destructive and aggressive acts. Responsibility, on the contrary, which is also an important issue in the codes, is a value that clearly involves positive commitment and the attitude of helping other peoples, and is therefore definitely more than a simple decision or wish not to harm or hurt. In recent years, Rüdiger Funjok has repeatedly argued that responsibility takes place on different levels, and that not only the producer of media content, but also their user is responsible for protecting the other person's human dignity. When Funjok declares responsibility to be the central value of media ethics, he takes up the long tradition of Martin Buber, Hans Jonas, or Emmanuel Levinas, all of whom have considered responsibility a fundamental principle of ethics. However, to act as a responsible person, you must have a certain amount of sensitivity. You must be able to pay attention to the other and have the willingness to emphasize with his or her situation. But there's more. There are also codes which require the actor's active involvement by demanding that the individual should feel responsibility for spreading counter-narrative against discrimination and hatred, or should practice a higher sense of serving the public. In addition to the values mentioned, there are a number of other values which do not appear in every document, but still in some of them. I am talking about serenity, discretion, objectivity, openness, diligence, and professionalism. The question therefore arises whether it is possible to define one value that adequately summarizes all these ideals. This value or concept would not only refer to the technical skills of using modern media, but also to the ability to understand their relevance and deal with it. And this is exactly what media ethicists mean by competence. It is the ability to act in a self-organized way in the light of changing demands, and it is broad enough to include the values mentioned above, since competence always depends on the context and is concretized differently in different situations. besides the openness of the concept, also has the strength that it is required to meet the rapidly changing challenges of the Web 2.0. After this short survey of the most important values that can be deduced from the various codes of self-commitment, what needs to be done is to apply them to the problem areas mentioned at the beginning. Before I do that, however, let me briefly quote Alexander Filipovich, who has translated the values mentioned into action recommendations. They are much more concrete than the values as such, and at the same time they show more clearly the connection with the topic that concerns us here, that is human dignity. First, transparency. Make sure that when acting there always is an adequate and correct relationship between representation and what is being represented. Keep your acting in the media as transparent as possible so that all that participate in the process and all that are concerned can verify your way of communicating and of shaping the media as to its correctness and non-delusion. Second, fairness. When acting in the media, make sure to obey the existing legal and moral rules. Treat people equally. Be just. Be fair and do not seek your own advantage or at the cost of others. Third, respect. When acting in the media, consider others as having the same rights as you. Do not only avoid disrespect, but actively pay respect to others. Appreciate them for their own value and accept their particularities and limitations. Watch your acting in the media with regard to politeness and non-discrimination, especially when creating a public space, when using images and expressing critique in whatever form. Fourth, responsibility. Before acting in the media and in communication, reflect upon the consequences of your actions and whether they can be justified. Align your acting in the media with the goal of good coexistence for all. Competence. Be professional in every respect. Observe the rules of craftsmanship that determine your acting in the media and your expertise. Act competently. Make sure that competence is being observed. Always be accurate in your work. Allow sufficient time for your colleagues and your team to work accurately and professionally. Stay calm and don't react emotionally when acting in the media. A person who realizes these guidelines in the social web and thereby puts into practice the values transparency, fairness, respect, responsibility, and competence contributes to strengthening human dignity. And this is important. For the mere theoretical commitment to an abstract concept such as human dignity does not result in making concrete people being better off, nor in enhancing and improving interactions between people. The case of human dignity only bears fruit if people really want to realize the dignity of others and are prepared to do something about it. Therefore, human dignity in Web 2.0 does not simply exist as such. We, that is each and every user, have to make every effort possible to realize it. With regard to the areas mentioned above, this means that I should realize transparency by not letting myself be guided by misinformation found in filter bubbles, but by checking carefully which content I can trust. As a result, I will uphold the dignity of the people I share information with and also of those who are being reported on, by clarifying where this information comes from or by only passing on information that is solid. Fairness, then, does not only mean not to engage in cybercrime malpractices, but also and above all not to be a silent spectator or an accomplice. When confronted with happy slapping, for instance, I will do everything I can to stop this process and to disrupt the victim's endless victimization. Respect means that I actively engage with others and with their rights, even so it is not as easy to feel empathy with others online as in real life. The same applies to responsibility. a principle I can realize in the internet by promoting projects of global neighborhood, by supporting aid projects, or raising awareness for the suffering of people who do not have a lobby and whose problems do not become apparent easily. But it's not only important to preserve the human dignity of others by implementing conscious media actions in the web. It is equally important to protect myself. I do so by acquiring competence and paying attention to whether my self-staging on Facebook or Instagram corresponds to what I really am, or whether I only present myself in order to get likes and followers. The list of examples could be continued endlessly. In any case, it should have become clear that human dignity in the Web 2.0 is not simply given, but a goal everyone can and should realize actively. The internet is a living space where people come together. The more the values we have been dealing with are being realized, the friendlier it will become and the more worth living. Thank you for your attention.